Clean architecture is one of the most famous software architecture these days. Some developers love it and others not so much. But honestly, when you get it right, it's one of the best ways to build highly scalable and maintainable apps. One of the areas where developers struggle is to create the right project structure. In this video, we are starting totally from the scratch in Visual Studio 2026 and setting up a full clean architecture solution ready for .NET 10. If you want to learn how to set up a clean project structure built for the future, keep watching. Welcome back to my channel. My goal today is to give you a foundational level project structure of the clean architecture that can save you countless hours down the road. If you love sports or you are a football fan like me, you will love the application we are building because we are building a league manager application where we will be dealing with entities such as clubs, stadiums, or players. We will build all the layers such as domain, application, infrastructure, persistence, presentation, and finally we will tie them all together in a web API startup project. By the end of this video, you will have the project skeleton that separates your internal business rules from the external concerns such as UI or databases. Let's dive in. For this video, I'm using the Visual Studio 2026, which is the latest version of Visual Studio released by Microsoft just a few days ago. First, open up the Visual Studio and create a blank solution. So let's call it League Manager. The very first thing I recommend is to create a solution folder for the source code. This helps keeps your source code projects separate from your test projects and keep everything tidy. The heart of the clean architecture is the domain layer, and this layer is very crucial because it holds your core business rules. In this layer, you define things such as entities, value objects, or aggregates. Let's create a new class library project in the solution and name it domain, or you can prefix it with your project name. In case it's a league manager, so I'm naming it league manager.domain. For the target framework, you can choose the .NET 10, which is the latest .NET version available for us. One of the important rules you need to keep in mind here is that this domain layer is totally isolated, which means it should not reference any of the projects from the outer layer. For now, we will leave it empty as we are setting up the structure. Next up is the application layer. This is where we define the use cases and the features of the application. Think of it as the main engine room of your application. So let's add a new application project, which will be another class library project, and this time I will name it League Manager.application. Once again, I'm choosing the .NET 10 as the target framework. The application layer needs to access the core business logic and rules from the domain layer. This is why it must have the reference of the domain layer. So let's add the domain project reference in the application layer. We also need to add some libraries in this project using the NuGet package manager. These libraries will help us to implement the CQRS later on. The first library is the Mediator library, and this is a very popular open source library that enables objects to communicate with each other through a mediator. Next, I'm adding the Fluent validation library that lets developers to create strongly typed validation rules for their models. There are two ways I can install this library. I can either use the Fluent validation library directly, or I can use the Fluent validation or dependency injection extensions that will automatically install the Fluent validation library. So let's add this package in the project. Now we need to decide how to wire up these libraries easily. I usually create a class called dependency injection where I register everything. So let's rename this class one as a dependency injection. This class will be a static class. Let's add an extension method in this class. This extension method will return the iService collection, and the name of the method can be add application. I'm passing the add service collection as a parameter of this method. Let's return the services object passed in this method as a parameter. In this method, I'm going to declare a variable that will hold the reference of the current assembly. Next, I'm going to configure the Mediator library using the addMediator method. And inside this method, I have several methods available to register the services. Let's use the registered services from assembly and pass the current assembly variable as a parameter. This method will scan and register all the requests and the handlers of the current assembly. Next, I'm going to configure a Fluent validation library using the method addValidators from assembly. This method will scan and register all the validators of the current assembly. Moving outwards in the clean architecture, we have an infrastructure layer. This layer deals with everything external. This includes connecting to external services or reading files. Let's add another class library project in the solution, and this time we will name it League Manager Infrastructure. We need to add a similar dependency injection class in this project. So let's copy that class from the application project and paste inside this infrastructure project. I need to rename the namespace of the project, and I need to name this function add infrastructure. Let's remove these registrations as we don't need these in this project. The reason I'm getting this error is because I don't have the iService collection reference available in the project. To solve this problem, you need to make sure you have a Microsoft.extensions.dependency injection library available in your project. So let's add that library from the NuGet package manager. Now I just need to add the using statement and the error will disappear. For now, let's leave this project empty. Next, we have persistence layer, and you can either create a separate project for persistence or you can add all the persistence functionality directly inside the infrastructure project. I usually create a separate project for persistence. The persistence layer deals with anything related to database access. This includes the data context, data migrations, or data seeding code. Let's add another class library project in the solution and call it League Manager.persistence. This time we can copy the dependency injection class from the infrastructure project and paste it inside the persistence project. Once again, I need to change the namespace name and also the method name. And I also need to add the same NuGet package Microsoft.extensions.dependency injections. The next layer of the clean architecture is the presentation layer. This is where you define how outside world interacts with your application. This might be your API controllers, minimal API endpoints, or even Razor pages. Let's add another class library project in the solution, and I'm going to name it League Manager.presentation. We can copy the same dependency injection file from the persistence project and paste it inside the presentation project. Once again, we need to change the namespace name and the method name. And we need to add the Microsoft.extensions.dependency injection package in this project. The last piece of the puzzle is the Web API project that will tie all these projects together and that will act as a startup application for your project. I'm creating a standard ASP.NET Core Web API project in this solution. Let's call it League Manager.Web API. For the target framework, I'm using the .NET 10. I don't need authentication, so I'm keeping it as none. I also don't need HTTPS for this demo, and we can leave all the other settings to their default values. Before we add the references of all the projects in the Web API layer, make sure all the other layers have the correct reference of the project. For example, I already added the domain project reference in the application. The application layer cannot reference any project from the external layer, but the external layers can reference the application layer. So let's add the reference of the application project in infrastructure project. Let's also add the application project reference in the persistence project. The Web API project need to reference the presentation layer, infrastructure layer, persistence layer, and the application layer. It doesn't need to reference the domain layer because the domain layer is already referenced in the application layer, and we will get the domain layer reference implicitly in the Web API project. So let's add all these references in the Web API project. Inside the program.cs file, we need to register all these layers one by one. We can register these layers by simply calling the methods we defined in those dependency injection classes in each project. And you can see we now have access to all those add methods we defined in the dependency injection classes in each project, which means we simply need to call these extension methods to register everything. So let's first call the add application method. Next, I'm calling the add infrastructure method. Next, we can call the add persistence method. And finally, we can call the add presentation method. This is how we tie all those separate layers together at runtime using a clean and chain interface. You now have a high-level project structure with the domain, application, infrastructure, persistence, and presentation layers. This structure is a great starting point and will evolve as your project grows. If you enjoyed setting up this structure with me, smash the like button. And don't forget to hit the subscribe because in my next few videos, I will be implementing all these layers one by one to complete this League Manager application. And you can learn how to implement all these layers step by step with me. Until next time, stay awesome.